Thank you for being here today. We'll call the committee to order. Of course, today's hearing is on social impact bonds, and our goal today is to review these innovative financing ideas and determine whether they can help government achieve better results for families in need. And to discuss this approach in greater detail, as well as legislation that he has introduced to promote the development of social impact bonds, I want to yield the balance of my time to the gentleman from Indiana, Mr. Young.
Well, I want to thank Chairman Reichert for holding this hearing today to discuss how social impact bonds can be an innovative tool to improve social and public health outcomes, save taxpayer resources, and unleash non-governmental investment capital to help at-risk Americans. I also want to thank our panelists for being here today to share your testimony with the committee. I want to give special recognition to Congressman Delaney, a Maryland Democrat, and a very conscientious colleague, for his leadership and partnership with me on this initiative. This is the sort of big idea, bipartisan initiative that we need more of in Washington, and he's helped make that happen here. Now, I've studied a bit of economics at the University of Chicago, and I want to start today with a quote from Milton Friedman, who once said, "One of the great mistakes is to judge policies and programs by their intentions rather than their results." I've spent the last 2 years on this subcommittee learning about many of our nation's social services programs, and I found that to ring exceedingly true. For all our best intentions, each of us knows that too often we see government programs fail the constituencies they're intended to help and the taxpayers who fund them. Unfortunately, instead of trying to determine how to get better results, serious discussions about social service provisions tend to devolve quickly into superficial arguments over funding levels. Instead of outcomes, we spend too much time talking about inputs. Now, to some, it's tempting to measure compassion with dollar signs, but this was not and is not what our social safety net is all about. Social impact bonds can help change our focus from inputs to outcomes where it belongs. They do this by requiring every approved project to answer 3 basic questions at the outset. 1, what does a successful outcome look like? 2, whom are we trying to serve? And 3, what is the value of a successful outcome in terms of current government spending? When those questions are answered, we can develop programs with measurable policy goals and measurable savings. Measurable policy goals and savings are preconditions to using social impact bonds as a funding mechanism to raise private investment capital, administer the evidence-based social intervention, and then if, and only if, those policy goals are met, the federal government can pay back those initial investors. If the goals aren't met, the federal government doesn't owe a dime. In essence, SIBs bring pay for performance to the social and public health sectors, allowing the federal government to improve both the impact and cost effectiveness of vital government services. In short, the Social Impact Bond Act, which I sponsored with Congressman Delaney, as well as Mr. Griffin and Mr. Reed on this subcommittee, and several Democrats, including Mr. Larson, who is joining us here today, empowers states, local governments, nonprofits, and the private sector to scale up evidence-based social and public health interventions to address some of our nation's most pressing social challenges. The results of these projects will help empower well-intentioned policymakers across all levels of government to improve lives through evidence-based policymaking, as well as aid nonprofits in expanding their models with fidelity across different geographies and populations. In turn, this expands our menu of policy options and offers meaningful alternatives to simply increasing funding for existing government programs that we know are less than successful at meeting their stated policy objectives. With that, I'll once again thank our panelists for being here today, thank the chairman for this opportunity, and I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Young. Mr. Doggett, would you like to give an opening statement?
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Welcome a discussion about how we invest in our future in a time when there's so many valuable initiatives that are limited by budget squeezes and even by sequestration, it's important to be as creative as possible. I salute Mr. Young, Mr. Larson, and their co-sponsors for recognizing the need to invest more in programs that will help low and middle-income Americans get an education, attain long-time employment, and be successful in other areas. We know that social impact bonds are a relatively new phenomenon, having, I believe, begun in the United Kingdom in about 2010. I'm familiar with the effort in New York City and Rikers Island, the work being done in Utah. The question we have today is the impact of social impact bonds as a new phenomenon and whether this is the best way to encourage stronger and more responsive communities. Since the states are laboratories of democracy, one question presented by today's hearing is whether federal intervention is necessary or desirable at this early stage. Most of us are familiar with the old saw that a conservative is someone who says, you go first. Well, we have a method in the states and the localities already to determine how effective these programs are and to evaluate whether they are accomplishing their objectives. I look forward to hearing from each of our witnesses on this question. I know that many of our programs, including those in which this committee has been involved in the past, face significant questions as to whether they can continue even next year. Home visiting for at-risk mothers and their children is set to expire next March. And I do have some doubts as to whether now is the time to implement a funding structure that will help put taxpayer dollars with some third-party investors instead of directly into the future of these children. I welcome the good counsel of all of those present, and I think we must be open to new ideas. We just need to be sure that those new ideas are the best way to make effective use of what are fairly precious taxpayer dollars. And I thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Doggett, and there is some agreement on the panel here. I want to thank all of you for being here, and we do look forward to the information that you'll provide us today. We are looking for new and innovative ways where we can help people in this country, and I think we need to keep an open mind as to how we do that, and your information today will help us determine if we should do anything in the federal government or not. So again, appreciate your testimony you're about to give, and thank you for being here again today. As I said, without objection, each member will have the opportunity to submit a written statement and have it included in the record. I want to remind our witnesses to limit their oral statements, please, to 5 minutes. However, without objection, all of the written testimony that you've submitted will be a part of the permanent record. On our panel this afternoon, we'll be hearing from Sam Schaefer, CEO, Center for Employment Opportunities, Robert Romo, former client, Center for Employment Opportunities, Linda Gibbs, Principal, Bloomberg Associates, David Jope, Senior Budget Operating Manager, Maryland Department of Legislative Services, and George Overholzer, CEO and co-founder, Third Sector Capital Partners. Mr. Schaefer, thanks for being here today, and proceed with your testimony, please.
Thank you, Chairman Reichert, Ranking Member Doggett, and all the members of the committee for highlighting social impact bonds at today's hearing. SIBs have the potential to scale some of this country's most effective social interventions, helping communities expand programs that have proven results and save taxpayer dollars. My name is Sam Schaefer, and I am the Executive Director and Chief Executive Officer of the Center for Employment Opportunities, or CEO. CEO is an organization devoted to exclusively meeting the employment needs of men and women with histories of incarceration. Since founded in New York City in 1996, CEO's Transitional Jobs Program has helped more than 16,000 people coming home from prison secure full-time employment. CEO has been proven through random assignment evaluation to reduce recidivism and provide up to $3.30 in taxpayer savings for every dollar invested in the program. Over the last 5 years, CEO has leveraged its expertise to expand into 10 cities across California, Oklahoma, and New York State. In a few moments, you'll hear from Robert Romo, one of the thousands of individuals we work with every year, on how CEO helped turn his life around. Robert's story illustrates the challenges so many face when coming home from prison. Every year, more than 600,000 people are released, but more than 40% will return. This failure is costly. The United States spends $64.3 billion annually on incarceration. It also has a profound effect on public safety, as well as families and communities impacted by the criminal justice system. Attracting new capital for prisoner reentry programs like CEO is critical. In December 2013, CEO, New York State, and the intermediary Social Finance began a 4-year SIB project that will help us serve an additional 2,000 high-risk, recently released men in New York City and Rochester. 44 private investors provided $13.5 million in capital to support this expansion of services. This is a performance-based contract, but instead of focusing on outputs like job placements, it hinges on our organization making an impact on recidivism and long-term employment. If a random assignment evaluation shows that individuals in the treatment group spend at least 8% fewer days in jail or prison than the control group, and shows a 5% increase in their immediate and long-term employment, USDOL and the state of New York will return investors their upfront capital. If we exceed these measures, returns can reach as high as 12.5%. But if the targets are not met, investors stand to lose their capital. CEO is excited to take part in this historic project. It represents a watershed moment in which both the state of New York and federal government are supporting the full funding of our core model, delivered to our primary service population. What's more, the contract aligns our partners in New York and Social Finance to drive effective performance management, fidelity, and collaboration. Congressman Young and Delaney's Social Impact Bond Act provides robust tools to create more deals like CEO SIB. Drawing on our organization's experience, I would humbly offer the following suggestions to help guide this nascent field, several of which are also contained in Young Delaney. Select experienced, proven providers. At this early stage, it is important to select service providers whose programs have been proven through experimental or quasi-experimental studies. For the field to gain steam, we need to construct projects around interventions most likely to demonstrate impact. Choose performance and repayment metrics carefully. Performance thresholds must be achievable based on a provider's track record. Projects should only aim to achieve results that are consistent with providers' historical performance. Attract new capital, don't cannibalize. One of CEO's interests in participating in a SIB was accessing new forms of financial support. If CEO's existing government or philanthropic funding were diverted to support this SIB, the project's appeal would have diminished considerably. Government champions are critical. For a deal to close and be successfully operationalized, strong government leadership is essential. Government must be committed as a payor, but also as a performance and operations partner. Help providers manage risk. Governments should provide tools for providers negotiating transaction. The risk of any large, high-profile project is significant, and they will benefit from help assessing evaluation design, investment terms, among other areas. Finally, cost-benefit is key, but it's not the only thing. We should find a way to support projects with clear societal, if not exclusively monetary benefits. Interventions focusing on violence reduction or literacy, for example, may show impacts, but fewer cost savings. These projects should receive support if they produce results government values. Not all social problems can or should be solved by SIBs, but in a resource-scarce environment, SIBs allow government to support proven interventions that show impact on a specific social problem. Perhaps most importantly, SIBs and the Young Delaney legislation have the opportunity to help change how cities, states, and the federal government support the social sector by persuading them to fund what works. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Schaefer. Mr. Romo, please.
Good afternoon, Mr. Chairman and members of the House Ways and Means Committee. My name is Robert Romo, and I'm very excited, very proud, and a little bit nervous to be here. Thank you so much for inviting me and letting me share my story. I was released from prison after doing 13 and a half years, and 3 days out, my parole officer gave me 2 options for employment programs to attend. The first program required me to wear a uniform that made me feel uncomfortable and reminded me of prison. I wanted to take my shot with CEO. As soon as I started CEO, I felt positive about gaining employment sooner than I thought. Everything felt professional from the first day. It felt good to come to class every morning at 7 a.m., to have a place to go that made me feel positive about myself. My life skill instructor consistently treated us like equals every day. It never felt phony, and that got my attention right away. She truly believed in me and pushed me to accomplish things that I was not sure I could. She instilled in me to do my best every day and to believe that my conviction did not define me. I was taught that presentation helps define who we are. I learned how to interact appropriately and professionally on the job. I learned self-confidence, and the CEO staff helped build my self-esteem. My job coach worked with me doing mock interviews. She never said my ways was wrong, but encouraged me to look at a different way of expressing my way of myself. I worked for 6 weeks on a part-time transitional job site doing maintenance on college campuses. I got a paycheck at the end of the shift, which was great. It helped me buy extra groceries to support my family. At the same time, I was attending the carpentry program at the CEO Training Center 2 nights a week. CEO kept me busy. There was not a lot of leisure time, which was very good because staying busy meant I was not tempted by bad habits and old acquaintances. I was totally focused on my future. None of this was easy, but my instructors motivated me, pushed me, and believed in me 100%. I had to get good grades on multiple tests and have good attendance to have CEO pay my tuition at a local community college for the next part of the carpentry program. I did it. And before the training was over, my job developer set up an interview for me at a hotel, and I was hired on the spot doing maintenance and carpentry. I kept in touch with CEO because they told me I could and should do something I love, not get stuck in just any job. I love construction, and they sent me on another interview, and again, I was hired on the spot. On that job, I met someone I knew while incarcerated. He told me about an opportunity with his window company and set up a meeting with his owner. I was planning to go in a suit, but my CEO job developer suggested I should dress like I was ready to start work that day, and I did. I was hired on the spot. I have been there since last October and have already participated in building 2 sites. Honestly, I could not have achieved all of this without the support of CEO. They helped me see beyond my conviction to a future that was really positive. I am grateful for the second chance. I always had a passion to help others who are in a similar situation, and CEO is helping me fuel that dream. This opportunity to speak today is just a first step towards fulfilling that goal. Thank you again for having me here today.
Well, if I can call you Robert.
Yes, sir.
Robert, you did an awesome job, so we couldn't even tell you were nervous. You did very good, very well. And we're so happy to have you here. And I imagine that there were times in your life where you probably didn't have much hope at all in getting a job, and here you are. You were hired on the spot at least 3 times. I've never been hired on the spot, my first applications in my previous career. And so congratulations on your success there. And I bet a few years ago you would never have thought you would have had the opportunity to testify in Congress, right?
Absolutely, sir.
Yeah. Well, you, as I said, you did an excellent job. You should be very proud, and we're happy to have you here today.
Thank you so much, sir. It means a lot.
You're welcome. Ms. Gibbs, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
That's a hard act to follow.
Yes, it is.
Good afternoon, Chairman Reichert, Ranking Member Doggett, and members of the Ways and Means Subcommittee on Human Resources. I'm Linda Gibbs, principal at Bloomberg Associates, which is a nonprofit consultant group that was established by Michael Bloomberg to support mayors in achieving their visions for the citizens of the cities they serve. Before joining Bloomberg Associates, I served as the New York City Deputy Mayor for Health and Human Services. Working in City Hall with Michael Bloomberg, we focused closely on poverty in New York City. The Young Men's Initiative was a key part of that work, and which was focused on reducing the disparities for young men of color across all social domains. The nation's first social impact bond was born out of that initiative as we searched for funding sources to help commissioners to launch innovative strategies to meet the mayor's challenge. The goal of RSIB is to reduce future jail time among adolescent inmates who are held on Rikers Island. We know from historic data that this population has a shocking 1-year recidivism rate of 50%. Half of them will be back on Rikers within 1 year. We were determined to change this outcome, but that left us with the question of what was going to prove the most promising model. While we had many post-discharge programs in place, we wanted to explore a jail-based strategy to counteract the negative effects of incarceration itself on later criminal behavior. We settled on an evidence-based cognitive behavioral therapy program called Moral Recognition Therapy, which emphasizes changing negative patterns of thinking as a way to reduce harmful, self-destructive, antisocial behaviors, and has evidence that demonstrates reduction in recidivism in the range of 15 to 30%, where it's been evaluated across the country. We adopted this, we called it ABLE, and we worked with two proven nonprofit providers to deliver the service, MDRC, National Research and Evaluation Shop, and Osborne Associates, who had a long history of work on Rikers Island. The independent Vera Institute of Justice will serve as our evaluator and will be monitoring the success of the program. Goldman Sachs fully funds the project's intervention by advancing a $9.6 million loan to MDRC. If recidivism, meaning return to Rikers, drops by 10%, the investor will be repaid the $9.6 million investment. At the 10% break-even point, the city will have an amount necessary to both repay that investment and to pay for the continuation of the program. Drops in excess of 10% produce increasing returns to the investor up to a total payout potential of $11.7 million, which at a recidivism reduction of 20%. Everything beyond that would accrue savings exclusively to the city. The investor's benefit is capped at that level. If the performance, if recidivism does not drop by 10%, a portion of the investor's investment will be protected by a guarantee fund provided by Bloomberg Philanthropies, which will protect part but not all of the investment. We've completed the first full year of service, and results on the reductions to recidivism will be calculated after a full year expires from the treatment cohort's exit from prison. We need to watch a full year after they leave to know what the recidivism rate is for those that receive the service. The program is funded to continue for 4 years, and the evaluation will continue for a full 7 years. So that's our program. Reflecting now more broadly on the issue of social impact bonds, I believe the model has great potential for a number of reasons. You've heard many of them already. SIB funding frees up the creative thinking process and can really stimulate innovation, the potential that the resource brings to the table. And it not only brings private capital forward to fund social programs, it directs a flow of capital to areas that current private markets typically do not serve, high-need communities without liquid access to private markets. SIBs also advance promising strategies. SIBs can help evidence-based projects being tested in one place to more easily jump government boundaries for replication elsewhere, and SIB investors can facilitate the scaling up of what works locally. Less attention has been given to what I believe is a different and very significant benefit. That is that SIBs elevate the tenor of outcome-based management in city halls and state houses, advancing skills in defining clear outcomes, measuring for results, and assessing governmental costs and benefits. In many ways, I believe the SIB's greatest potential for government is that it is bringing this expertise to the table, particularly for small jurisdictions without the ability to invest in large research capacities. The field of SIB practice is making straightforward tools more broadly accessible. But SIBs are not a panacea. They are not appropriate, for instance, when the intervention will not produce government savings. There are many social programs that should and need to be done, but just require an outlay of government expenditure or philanthropic investment. So SIBs will not serve every purpose. Other programs produce savings, but they take too long for them to be realized to be relevant in an investor's time frame, or they are too dispersed to be easily recouped. Although I would note that the Young-Delaney bill, 4885, would solve part of that problem by making it easier to recoup those federal savings that do accrue. Two other cautions I would note: without good data management systems, evidence cannot be produced to satisfy the rigor of the model. Over time, I would expect this will improve as government agencies become more adept and systems are more widely available at reasonable costs. Great expertise is developing and structuring programs to be administratively simple and increasingly well-structured to avoid practitioner bias, but this is also an emerging expertise, and design considerations are significant. And this effort is in its infancy. Transaction costs can still be high and prohibitively high for many. Again, as skills develop and tools proliferate, these barriers should drop, making the practice more widely available. In sum, I'm optimistic that SIBs offer great potential to move the field of sound social service practice forward, providing well beyond the short-term benefits of new investment dollars to providing sound outcome-based management expertise. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Juppé. Is that pronounced correctly? Is it
Juppé, yes, thank you. Good afternoon, Chairman Reichert, Ranking Member Doggett, and members of the subcommittee. My name is Dr. David Juppé, and I'm a Senior Operating Budget Manager with the nonpartisan Department of Legislative Services in Maryland. I spent the last 25 years analyzing operating and capital budgets and making recommendations on fiscal policy. I got involved with social impact bonds in 2012 when a former colleague, Kyle McKay, who's now with the Texas Legislative Budget Board, began examining a proposal by Maryland's Department of Public Safety and Correctional Services to utilize a social impact bond for reentry program funding for the purpose of reducing recidivism by at least 10%. So I'll talk a little bit about the findings of our paper briefly. As mentioned, there are a number of potential benefits for social impact bonds, but since it's a fairly new financing mechanism, you should also be aware of some of the concerns and issues that, that counteract some of the proposed benefits. I'm not terribly surprised that social impact bonds would be considered at this point, since the Great Recession of 2008, governments at all levels have been cutting back spending, and certainly it could be expected that providers would be seeking a long-term source of revenue. So you have various mechanisms like social impact bonds, public-private partnerships, and the like are gaining in popularity. Some of the risks that we would raise for your attention, at least consideration, first off is there's a higher cost to government for social impact bonds. Governments can and do procure contracts and services from private and nonprofit vendors through competitive procurements and single-source procurements every year, and pretty much paid simply a direct cost, whereas under a social impact bond, you have not only the direct cost, you have the potential for return on investment costs, costs for independent evaluations, as well as additional costs such as management fees for intermediaries that link the financing with the providers and with governments. Related to this is the question of whether or not governments can really avoid having funding up front provided in their budgets annually in terms of appropriations. One issue related to this is the fact that when you look at state and local government budgets, typically they build a request based off of their base, and they often get a request ceiling or a target for the next year. So it'd be very difficult, or more difficult certainly in this constrained fiscal environment, for a level of government to provide $10, $20, $30 million above its base funding to pay a multi-year social impact bond payment. Certainly, you'd also expect that investors would like to see some sort of security. I mean, certainly when purchasers of government-issued debt, either GO bonds or revenue bonds, see some sort of security in the forms of debt service reserve accounts, the bonds are insured, or you may see debt service coverage ratios. But right now, the only security you have is the expectation that potentially governments will appropriate the funds. A second issue that I would raise has to do with overstated cost savings and the likelihood of success. I've seen a number of proposals over the years, boot camps, community courts, drug courts, like social impact bonds. In many instances, it seems like there's a proclivity to taking the total cost of a facility, dividing it by the total number of cases, and deriving a cost per case, and claiming that's the savings. So, for example, you may have a prison where it costs roughly $30,000 per offender, but that includes all fixed and variable costs. So the savings from 100 inmates would not be $3 million, as you might expect with the simple math. Typically, unless you shut down an entire wing or entire facility, you really only save the variable costs of food, supplies, and medical costs. And in 2012, when we did our study, the variable cost was about $4,600 per offender in the Maryland prison system. So just in short, just to say about our summary of our findings, we looked at a program that would involve 250 offenders and we estimated cost of $4.1 million over 5 years against savings of about $250,000. So that pilot project would end up costing the state about $3.9 million. Also, with social impact bonds, we have a concern that short-term incentives could skew results to try to ensure success so that the investors get their return. And this could include selecting the most treatable offenders or cases, a short-term focus on getting results as opposed to maybe longer-term programs, and again, I think a flight to safety, so the potential for focusing on programs that you know are successful, so there's a greater likelihood of investors getting their money back. One other issue I would simply raise is just the risk versus the rate of return. We're seeing in social impact bonds a number of different negotiated on a case-by-case rates of return, 13% in Peterborough. I think I saw 22% on one of the other social impact bonds. And in the bond market, risk of non-payment is measured by bond rating agencies, and you also have a number of other factors such as the length of the maturity and so forth. With social impact bonds, if for a short-term program, it seems like the rate of return can be fairly inordinate, and especially if there's a flight to safety and there's not as much risk, or in instances where in New York City, where a portion of the social impact bond was guaranteed by the Bloomberg Foundation, then risk is very slight indeed. In closing, I've included in my written testimony some considerations for the legislation that you have before you. And I would just close by saying that social impact bonds do carry some risks, and in addition to the benefits, I think you need to weigh carefully both the good and the bad here. Thank you.
Thank you for your testimony. Mr. Overholzer.
Thank you, Chairman Reichert, Ranking Member Doggett, and members of the subcommittee. Very pleased to be here. Just by way of introduction, I had a business career. I was on the founding management team of Capital One, and then had a venture capital business that I built called North Hill Ventures. But for the past 10 years, I've spent more or less full-time on the social sector. But the one thing that connects all the work I've done is riding on the megatrend that I think is behind the social impact bond discussion and pay for success discussion we're having today, which is the inexorable and very powerful drop in the cost of computation and in the cost of capturing data. And what we're really seeing here is that for the first time in history, just as it was true for the credit card industry 15 years ago, the cost of measuring outcomes has gotten to the point where we can actually do performance-based contracting based on outcomes, something which I think we would have done 20, 30 years ago if it were economically feasible. This cost is only going to continue to go down further, especially as we learn the art of performance-based contracting in this subsector. 2 or 3 years ago, I co-founded a nonprofit called Third Sector Capital Partners. We currently have 25 people, and we spend 100% of our time working with partners around the country, putting together pay-for-success contracting that has SIBs as a source of loans for the financing associated with those contracts. Currently, we have about 15 projects underway, and our first project was a $27 million transaction that we helped to set up in Massachusetts, which was based on variable costs. I think many of the points that Mr. Juppé brought up are highly valid, and we see it as our job to bring scrutiny to these arrangements so that they are of the highest fidelity. In Massachusetts, it was another recidivism project. In this case, it was helping an intervention that was, it's called ROCA, which is a tremendous intervention that could not find its way to scalable funding. And the pay-for-success approach found a way to get scaling of this program so that 900 gang-involved youth could avoid the terrible obstacle, terrible statistic of a 60% expected prison recidivism rate with an average of more than 2 years in prison. Each of our 15 projects has an enthusiastic government sponsor behind it. And these people, I have learned, around the country are extraordinarily busy. So why would they take on something so difficult as to basically undergo procurement reform, which is what I believe Pay for Success is about? And as I speak to them, here are the answers that I hear. First and foremost, these are public servants, and they realize the current strategies just simply aren't working for the families in need in this country. At the same time, they know that there are untapped innovations that are waiting in the wings, and what they're looking for is a mechanism that makes it possible and easier to surface the best interventions for the families in need and get them implemented at greater scale, with greater fidelity, and with strong focus on outcomes. They also realize that they don't have the working capital to get this done, and so they like the idea of lenders coming in. And I should mention that in our 15 projects around the country, more than half of the money is coming from philanthropists. It's not coming from banks. It's coming from philanthropists who are looking for no return or for an exceedingly modest return. But what they're able to do is to absorb the risk of failure on these experimental pilots. And that allows public servants, people in government, to go after innovations that they otherwise might not be able to go after and often would never go after. The other thing that happens is that bringing in private partners, we tap into human capital. If you work in government, which you do, and I'm learning as someone who's now traveling around the country, there is no one available on that staff to do the hard work of learning how to grapple with data, how to conduct deep due diligence, which is inherent to an outcomes approach. And so the private partners bring human beings who bring this type of expertise that otherwise would not be present, and I think is very important. Then the last, probably most important, is having a mechanism in place that recognizes not that something is great now, but it recognizes when a program is no longer working. I would say government is very good at funding stuff that used to work, but it's not very good at recognizing when stuff isn't working anymore. At Capital One, we did 3,000 tests a year. And what we discovered is that our best innovations rarely lasted. And this was such a profound part of our business that we put posters all over the company of melting ice cream cones. And the poster said, "It melts like ice cream." And what we were saying was, whatever you do, don't stop innovating. What happens, I believe, with the way we do social policy is we have a fund what once worked system. And the joke I like to make is if we did music the same way we do social policy funding, we would all be listening to Meatloaf on an 8-track recording machine. And that's because 30 years ago, Meatloaf was great music, not to diss Meatloaf, but 30 years ago, Meatloaf was all the rage, and the 8-track machine was cutting-edge technology. And you can imagine someone would say, this is great, there ought to be a law, everyone should have access to this, let's write it up like a recipe card into a law and say anyone who offers this standard of music and this standard of technology will be reimbursed. But if you don't follow the recipe, you won't be reimbursed. And that, to me, is a formula for freezing the system, and that's why we're stuck with programs that no longer work. Thank you.
Very good. Thank you, Mr. O'Walls. Those last few words really resonated with me. I don't know if you know my background, Robert, but I was a police officer for 33 years before I came here, so I just look like I've been here 40 years. But I want to visit with you afterwards. I'm very proud of you. And I really agree with the comments that you made again at the end. Funding those programs that used to work, I think has been a mistake that we've made across the board in a lot of social services and aid and help to families. So this is why this hearing is so important, to get the good news out about some of the new programs and new efforts that are being made across the country. And Mr. Overholzer, in your testimony and your work at Third Sector Capital, suggests that this social impact bond financing model has been catching on rapidly at the state and local level. Is this the case, and why do we need federal legislation to implement it on a nationwide basis.
Thank you for the question, Chairman Reichert. Indeed, I do think there's a great deal of interest around the country. As I mentioned, we have about 15 projects underway, and each one of them does have a government sponsor. I would hasten to add, though, that many of these projects face considerable obstacles that could be addressed through federal legislation that I'll explain in a moment. The Massachusetts project, I would also mention, had as a major impetus a DOL match that was a federal match. And interestingly, that DOL program that challenged states and counties to come up with rigorous pay-for-success constructs caused many, many more applications to be developed, many, many more initiatives and investigations to take place around the country than actually were awarded in the end. In the end, only 2 of them were awarded. One of them was our project in Massachusetts. I would also say that the deadline that was imposed as part of that DOL federal grant created great impetus. I'm not sure we would have gotten the project done if we did not have the benefit of that match. Because there's an impetus that comes if you have a match available from the federal level. It allows a local politician to look at folks in the eye who may say, no, wait a minute, why are you spending time on this? And it allows them to say, you know, we are able to tap into some funding that we could not otherwise tap into. And even if that funding might be quite small, it changes the discourse. I would also say that this federal involvement sets much needed standards. Mr. Juppe brought up many pitfalls. That if we, for example, in Massachusetts did not look at the variable cost behavior of prisons, that would have been a bad thing. And so I love the idea of having a federal match that says, hey, this match is contingent on quality standards as spelled out in the law. There's also money there for feasibility studies. It's a modest amount of money, but when you look at local government, that money does not exist. So a very small amount of money for feasibility can unlock major initiatives. And then finally, as Linda Gibbs pointed out, many of these social programs around the country, of course, have federal savings that are generated. So work at the local level can generate savings at the federal level. But if you aren't able to tap into those savings and have that feedback loop of the savings, then the cost benefits don't work as a matter of economics. And so the presence of and this is sometimes called the wrong pocket problem, but the presence of a feedback loop that goes up to the federal spending streams will make it so that more of these initiatives find the cost benefit that they need in order to be successful propositions.
You've answered question 2 and 3 as a follow-up question to your first question, so thank you for your answer. And Mr. Schaefer, you talk about the rigorous evaluation of the CEO model and the results of your model. I'm going to shorten this up just a little bit because of time. Given that CEO has been shown to be effective, why should government fund it through a social impact bond and not just contract with you directly? Or why not just turn it into a government-run program? Is this just a more expensive way of contracting out, as Mr. Juppe contends?
Thank you for the question, Chairman Reichert. I'd say on the one hand, CEO is extremely proud of the evidence base we've developed over the last several years, right? Proving that you can reduce people going back to prison is hard work. But on the other hand, I'm not sure government at any level, city, county, federal, has quite caught up in really adopting that ethos of funding what works. And so this project offers us a tremendous opportunity to build additional evidence, but also build a proof point around really getting government to take hold of this different ethos of funding what works. And for us, that's really exciting. And my hope would be at the end of this project, we would reach really what we could term a performance-based contracting 2.0 type approach, where the state of New York, now seeing that we did a really great job, we reduced people going back to jail or prison, would want to contract with us directly. But I would also be quite understandable at this point that we're not just at that level yet. I'd also say, though, in the SIBs, there's a tremendous thing that a few of the other witnesses hit on, is just the deepness of collaboration that this brings apart between government and a contracting partner. So frequently we enter into a contract at the end of a year or end of 2 years, we produce results, or we don't produce results, and we report back to government. Given the reputational risk that I think all parties here are taking on, there's been a tremendous experience for us to really work hand in glove with the state of New York to solve operational problems when they arise, to go through everything from how someone even comes to our program to how they get placed in a job, really with a partnership in government, not just as a contractor-contractee relationship.
All right, just jotting down some notes there while you're talking. Thank you so much for your answer. Mr. Doggett, you're recognized for your questioning.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. As I indicated in my opening statement, I believe we need to look for innovative ways like this. I wish we had more Bloomberg foundations across the country to participate in the significant way that your foundation has and the mayor has in New York City. I'm a little concerned, though, about the practicalities and reflect on the experience that my state and some others have had, where we were told if we just privatize state services and turn it over to some multinational consultant, we'd save a tremendous amount of money. And what has in fact happened is that we've had one lawsuit after another as taxpayer resources have been wasted with some of those privatization efforts. Here, the idea of bringing in bond lawyers, consultants, lawyers into the process at a time when we have so many immediate needs concerns me some. In this very committee, we face a situation where we will see major cuts, barring some new budget agreement, in education and social services next year in federal funding through the sequestration agreement. The nurse-family partnership funded through the visiting nurses, we could extend for about another year at the same price as is reserved in this bill. And at the moment, we have no funding source for it whatsoever. I think it is a cost-effective program that we need to extend. In fact, I think every program that we invest in needs to be evidence-based. We should be applying these standards on all government expenditures, except for those that we set aside for what are truly innovative programs that we want, where we want to try out a new concept. Mr. Juppé, my understanding is that your colleague Kyle McKay at the Texas Legislative Budget Board, who testified on social impact bonds in front of the Senate Budget Committee earlier this year, reached similar conclusions to yours, that in many cases the cost of using the social impact bond outweighed any benefits the state got in modest impact on its cost. Is that right?
Yes, that's correct.
And can you tell us some of the costs associated with establishing and implementing social impact bonds that need to be considered along with the benefits of those bonds?
Well, yes, in addition to the direct service cost, you have the return on investment at whatever rate that's negotiated. You also have a cost for an independent third-party evaluation to ensure the outcomes were met. And then finally, you can also have additional costs for the intermediary in terms of a management fee or contract for arranging for the financing, the contractor and the government to get together in that social impact bond.
It's been suggested that the benefit of social impact bonds, that they'll help us grow the pie overall in terms of state or federal funding for these programs. And certainly we need to do that. But you pointed out that the states may need to put aside funding to reimburse private investors for these projects. In terms of state budgets, will social impact bonds actually free up additional funds to invest in social initiatives?
I think it's actually more likely that government at the state level would have to put aside the funds for the service plus the additional costs associated with the social impact bond, and then have those funds appropriated each year, and then at the end of each year encumber those funds for when the actual social impact bond program was completed. So I think it would be additional cost each year.
Ms. Gibbs has appropriately noted that these aren't a panacea. Even where they do work, does turning over a decision to private investors about where those dollars will be invested in order to secure a return bias the process of determining what needs will be met and what needs will not be met.
Yeah, I don't see this as a privatization. The thing that is really important to remember is that the relationship of the government and the service is by a negotiated contract between government and a service provider. 90% of the social services in New York City are provided in that manner now with nonprofit organizations. So fundamentally, government is making a decision of what it wants to purchase and under what conditions, and the investor is, for a social impact bond, is making a determination whether or not that is a risk, a relationship that the investor is willing to take. But ultimately, the evidence around what the program's outcomes are, first of all, have to align to the governmental purpose, and then second, for the purpose of whether or not it's a civil event, would have to show that the government savings. And the contract itself is up to the government partner to enter into. So it's not privatization in a private investor who is implementing a program for profit. The fundamental nonprofit relationship with the service provider remains in place. And in the case of the New York City, we're a gap financing jurisdiction. We have to have a balanced budget every year with revenues in paying for costs incurred. And under those rules, the lawyers determined that the contract payments would not have to be accrued or recognized in our budget until they actually became due. So there was no obligation to put money up front. And in fact, that's one of the beauties of the SIBs, is that the taxpayers do not have to put the money up front. The investor bring in the upfront money, and ultimately the taxpayers only have to pay if it actually works.
Thank you very much. Thanks to all our witnesses, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Young. You're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate Mr. Juppé's critical feedback and thoughts on the SIB model. Ms. Gibbs' responses to some of those thoughts, and would entertain any other thoughts Mr. Overholzer or Mr. Schaefer might have about Mr. Juppé's concerns.
Yes, thank you. I would agree very much with what Ms. Gibbs said about privatization. On the 15 projects that we're working on, every one of them begins with a pay-for-success contract between government and a nonprofit provider. And in most cases, these are nonprofit providers who already contract regularly with government, and government is sitting at the table and has the decision rights about who the provider is and what the program design looks like. So this is certainly not an outsourcing to private decision makers of how taxpayer dollars are being spent. There's a very useful distinction between pay-for-success contracting, which is what we just were describing, and then the SIB. The SIB is just a loan. What it says is that instead of the provider taking on the risk of maybe never being paid, a group of philanthropists and perhaps some banks as well will provide them a special type of a loan. And the loan is not to government. The loan is actually to the project itself. The loan will never be repaid if the project fails to produce outcomes, because there won't be money to repay the loan. And so therefore, these lenders are not like normal bond lenders. They're taking on tremendously more risk. It's not just the risk of the government failing to honor its obligation, which is called counterparty risk, but there's a much larger risk, which is in a world where considerably less than 50% of those social strategies that are put to the test under a randomized controlled trial, considerably less than 50%, some people would say 90% of those programs bring about no discernible level of impact, meaning you cannot tell the difference between those who are in the program versus those who are not in the program very, very often. This is an extremely high risk of non-performance that the government no longer needs to take and that providers no longer need to take. So when we talk about the economics, imagine you spend 10% more to put one of these projects together because they're new and it's quite difficult now. I think they're going to become lower than that in the future. But imagine you spent 10% more. And instead of 50% of them not working, 20% of them didn't work. Well, in that case, government would end up spending 20% less money, because when it didn't work, government wouldn't need to spend.
If I could very quickly interject, has it been your experience, Mr. Overholzer, as working with the various counterparties on putting together these series of contracts that constitute a SIB, that government has learned to calculate savings on a net basis, that is net of management and transaction fees, number one, and have they also understood the difference between variable costs and fixed costs and thus factored that into future savings?
The answer is yes.
Okay.
In every case, it's very important to have the economists come in and work through what are the true cost economics.
Thank you. Mr. Schaefer?
Yeah, I would echo that, sir. We have a current active SIB in New York State, in which the state was very focused on ensuring the variable cost rate was considered. And as we consider a SIB in San Diego as well, they're laser focused on that issue.
I'd further add the issue of giving security to investors in an incipient, inchoate market is certainly very important. I'm glad that Mr. Juppé brought that up. Based on my field research in the United Kingdom and their work on SIBs, their development of SIBs, they emphasize the importance of allocating money, a pot of money that would offer that additional security, though not essentially necessary, additional security that a contract would not be broken in the future by a future Congress or government. So that's been incorporated into Young Delaney. Is there anything additional, Mr. Overholzer, that you would add based on your experiences to prevent investors from, you might say, gaming the system? That is, trying to reach outcomes so that they get their outcome payments, but not in fact improving the lives of services. What has been done in the past to prevent this?
I would begin by saying that the current system is also, you could call it gamed, in the sense that the name of the game is to follow the rules that were written in a recipe that probably is very obsolete, and that the new game is to try to get the needle to move on a set of metrics that we hope are well chosen. Very importantly, we must continuously measure outcomes. Very importantly, we must use randomization as opposed to other methods, because other methods will invite what some people will call creaming. And very importantly, it is helpful to have a market basket of metrics rather than a single metric, as my old friend, the co-founder of Capital One, used to call it, beware monovariabilitis. We don't want to just have one variable.
Thank you. I yield back.
Mr. Renacci, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to thank the witnesses for testifying today. Mr. Overholzer, just this year, Cuyahoga County proposed a way to help homeless children stay with their own families and avoid the foster care system through the use of social impact bonds. The county spends about $35 million annually on foster care. I understand the administration has been working with your company. Are you able to share any details on the progress of that program?
You're speaking of Cuyahoga County?
Yes, Cuyahoga County.
Yes, we're very excited about that project. We're making great progress there, and we think something that is going to be a winner, but we have not yet come in for landing, so I'm not able to share all the details. The basic idea there is that homeless mothers tend to have children who are highly involved in the foster care system. And if you think about it, we thought this was a homelessness project until we discovered that investments on the homelessness side actually can affect what's happening over on the foster care side. So this is a mechanism that makes it possible to do work in one area of government that brings about savings in another area of government, and to build a feedback loop. That's that wrong pocket problem. Government is very, very poor, does a very poor job, I believe, at being able to take advantage of these interagency relationships, and that's what we're most excited about in Cuyahoga.
Thank you. And this is a question for anybody on the panel, because I'm trying to get a feeling. I mean, what we have here is an intermediary. There's a bond that is the source of funds to do this program, and then if the program is successful, the bonds are paid back with a premium of whatever, 10, 11, 12%. How about the thought, what's the downside of just contracting for success? What's the downside of eliminating the bond procedure and just contracting for success, eliminating all the fees, and coming up with an outright contract that says, if you do this, you get paid, and if you don't do this, or if you do this, you get paid with a fee, and if you don't do this, you don't get paid, just without. So I'd love to hear from any one of you as to what your thoughts are.
I'm sorry, Sam. I would say from a government manager's perspective, I in fact see social impact bonds as part of a broader family of performance-based contracting. And the world of performance-based contracting, where people are paid in some fashion, their payment is contingent on outcomes, can be everything from 100% at risk, only paid if you hit a milestone, or can be a bonus on your payment. So the difference in those scenarios, where it's 100% milestone, it tends to be very input-oriented. You get a payment if you complete an interview with a client. You get a payment if a client enrolls in a training class. You get a payment if a client completes a training class. The nature of social impact bonds is that they're very much more focused on those longer-term social outcomes, the real good that you're trying to get after. So I would distinguish it that way, because nonprofit providers simply can't take the gamble around those longer-term outcomes, and they don't have the cash flow to wait for those. They need the revenues now.
But not to interrupt, but aren't they taking the gamble on the bonds? I mean, that's where
Not the nonprofit providers. The only one who's taking the gamble financially is the investor.
Well, it's the same. That's what I'm getting. It's the intermediary. It's somebody outside of the government that's taking the risk.
The government and the service provider are not. The investor is. And the other big difference, of course, is that the social impact bonds bring in new cash now, versus if it's a performance-based contract, you have to appropriate the dollar value of that contract in the year that you contract it, and with a pretty much knowledge that 80 or 90% minimally will be paid, and potentially 105 to 110% will be paid, depending on the incentive structure that you've built into your contract.
Anybody else want to take a run at it?
Ms. Gibbs gave most of my answer, but I would echo sort of from the vantage point of our project, we're looking at jail and prison bed days, which is a metric that we have no other contract that measures, but it's ultimately the real social good, or one of the two real social good that CEO is achieving. So as opposed to, say, looking at something like job placements, which is really important, it's what helped Mr. Romo turn his life around, we're taking a longitudinal look at what CEO's impact is 3, 4, 5 years into the future. And SIBs are a great mechanism for looking at those longer-term impactful measures rather than the shorter-term government contracts. And I would add, too, as a provider, we'd be very happy to take government contracts that paid us for the full cost of our services. It has not.
If you were successful.
If we're successful.
And if you weren't successful, you didn't get paid.
We get paid up front in this deal. It would be too much risk for us to take to not enter into something where we had such variability.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Mr. Davis.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I am pleased that we're holding this hearing. I am interested in social impact bonds to see if they can leverage public dollars with private investment to expand high-quality prevention programs to improve key social problems. The topics of the initial social investment bonds are of particular interest to me. The state of Illinois has advanced a Pay for Success program to increase support for youth involved in both the child welfare and juvenile justice systems to improve their outcomes. Further, part of the President's Pay for Success budget proposal was up to $10 million via the Department of Justice's Second Chance Act a program that I worked bipartisanly to enact into law to implement the permanent supportive housing models. However, I also want to ensure that social investment bonds do not take away funding from existing programs and services that provide critical support to our citizens. I also want to make sure that the return on investment is reasonable and not a windfall to the investment community. Mr. Jumpy, social impact bonds have been touted as a way to fund innovative programs, but you have suggested that the opposite might be true. In other words, pressure from private investors who want limited risk might steer funding to more proven methods. If this is true, do you think it is more appropriate to provide direct funding for these proven programs?
Yes, absolutely. I would agree that it would be more cost-effective to provide direct contracts. There's plenty of examples where governments can undertake requests for proposals, requests for information with vendors to develop innovative strategies. Maryland's currently undergoing negotiations with private vendors for the construction and operation of a Purple Line extension between New Carrollton and Bethesda, and as such is structuring those contracts in negotiations with various interested parties to determine the most cost-innovative strategies for constructing that line and operating it. So certainly you don't have all the additional expense of a social impact bond, which, as we've heard, is really relating to the financing of the services.
Are you concerned that the returns provided to investors from social impact bonds may not be commensurate with the risk they're bearing? If mostly proven programs are funded, does this significantly reduce the risk of a project failing to meet performance measures? Additionally, do you worry that the complexity of the contracts that involve the SIBs might make the balance between risk and reward unclear as well as uncertain?
Yes, absolutely. I would agree with that. Certainly, there's no standards nationally or within states for how you calibrate the risk and the return on investment. And as we've seen, for example, in Peterborough, it's been cited as a very complex arrangement, and it's unclear entirely how the outcomes will relate to the payments to the investors. For example, in the first year, the recidivism rate's been reduced by 8.4%. I believe the first-year cohort required a reduction in recidivism of 10% to provide a payment. So there's no payment for this first cohort. But it sounds like in 2016 there could be a payment if the first and second-year cohort realizes a reduction of 7.5%. So it certainly skews the outcomes, definitely, as well as there's the concern between how you calibrate the risk and the return.
Thank you very much. And Mr. Romo, let me congratulate you on finding a job and for all of your efforts to create a new life for yourself. What was the biggest barrier you felt that you needed to overcome in order to secure a job?
Thank you for the question. I really believe that the tools that CEO provided me with and the mentality that I allowed myself to believe that, I wasn't going to be successful anymore due to the time that I did behind prison. I feel that it was helpful and very important because we come out with a low self-esteem and no guidance, don't know how to really find certain responses to be successful and make the transition back into society positive.
Thank you very much. Mr. Overholser, you suggested that social impact bonds could reduce the waste of $720 billion per year. That budget figure includes tax relief for working families through the Earned Income income tax credit and child tax credit, Pell Grants for college students, health care for veterans, school lunch program, and long-term care for seniors through Medicaid. Do you consider any of those programs wasteful?
I consider them programs that could have higher and better use of the same amount of funding. And so my interest is in creating a mechanism that reallocates money towards their highest and best use. And so many of these programs, yes, could have different strategies used that when put to the test can be shown to be a more efficacious use of that funding.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Griffin.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I'm proud to be a original co-sponsor of Mr. Young's bill, and I just want to applaud all the work that Mr. Young in particular has done on this issue. I want to ask you, Mr. Overholser, a little bit, if you would comment a little bit about the value that investors add to a particular enterprise. We heard some talk about directly funding. It seems to me that the value here of the overall program lies in the value that the investors add to the intervention or the enterprise. Because when the government just cuts a check to a nonprofit, there is a different sort of pressure, if any, put on that nonprofit to perform than if you get an energetic investor who uses their own money and shows up at the door every day to check on the progress. So it seems to me that the investors want to get their money back and redeploy it elsewhere, and they bring energy and oversight in a detailed way, what the government almost never provides. If you could comment on that, if you would. And it seems to me there's a big difference there between the government just cutting a check to somebody. And that therein lies the value of the reason we're having the whole hearing, seems to me. Can you comment on that?
I would agree with most of what you're saying. And I guess my view is I would prefer an end game where it is direct contracting. I would prefer to have a world where government procurement is changed and that the actual human beings working in government acquire the skills that currently we're needing to bring in from the outside. And I would love to get to the point where providers themselves are on a solid enough financial footing that they don't need to seek private financing because of their concerns about maybe this thing won't work. So I see a world, frankly, that doesn't have social impact bonds. It just has pay-for-success contracting. That's where I would like us to get. I believe that in order to get there, there's a period of time where it is very helpful to tap into what the private side can bring that's not present currently in government. And absolutely, we are finding that bringing in experts in how to use data better, bringing in experts in how to assess risk better into these project teams is very valuable. I'd also say that the time span of these projects is longer than most political cycles. And so something quite unique about the public-private partnership setup is that if you have private partners who are working on a 7-year time frame, they're going to bring a continuity of focus to a project that is absolutely required if you have work that needs 7 years to conduct. And so the cadence of government decision-making, the political cycles are shorter than the absolute truth of what is required to bring about the long-term changes we're looking for in our communities.
I agree with some of what you said, though. I'm not sure we ever get to this ideal. I mean, you were talking about all the things that you...
We may never get there.
Yeah.
So it's more
my
the
kids
ideal
want to live in a
work
world of
backwards
unicorns and glitter, but that's just not happening. And we've had decades of either underperformance or failure, or I mean, it seems to me this is This is reaching outside of the system to bring in proven innovators, even though a particular idea may not be innovation. We're bringing in people who have been successful and who have a stake in the success of this enterprise. Mr. Schaefer or Ms. Gibbs, or if anybody else wants to comment, it'd be great in my limited time.
Yeah, absolutely, sir. CEO would like to believe, and I think we do a great job on all our contracts. And you're right, to most extent, it is government cutting us a check, and on a quarterly basis or a yearly basis, I'll report back the outcomes. There is something to what you're saying, I believe, in the high-profile nature of this project, in which we're putting our neck out there a little bit, the government's taking a risk, the investors are taking a risk, and that shared interest, I do believe, is driving performance from the leadership of our organization to the case management level. In Mr. Overholzer's world, I would absolutely agree. That's a place that we want to aspire to, and how quickly we can get there, I think, is on all of us to try to figure out. Skin
in the game is what
that's the right metaphor.
I'm out of time. In an ideal world, we wouldn't run out of time.
Thank you, Mr. Griffin. Mr. Crowley, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for holding this hearing today. I appreciate the comments from both sides here this afternoon. And it's great to see some friends from New York here as well. I'm proud that New York, both the city level and on the state level, have been so involved in the undertaking of some of these projects. There's a lot we're still learning about the effect of social impact bonds and these types of projects, but I appreciate the fact, as I said before, that New York City, New York State are leaders in trying new approaches to solving complex problems. New York State started with a project to reduce recidivism and increase employment among high-risk, formerly incarcerated individuals. And Mr. Schaefer and Mr. Romo, thank you for sharing your experiences with these projects. In New York City, we've also had an undertaken in an effort to reduce recidivism, particularly teen recidivism at Rikers Island, which is in my district. I've seen firsthand the challenges with respect to recidivism at Rikers and the need to find solutions that focus on prevention and long-term strategy. So I'm very glad that we have former Deputy Mayor for Health and Human Services, Linda Gibbs, with us here as well, discussing New York City's efforts in these areas. So thank you all for being here. These are problems for which there is no easy answer, and I welcome efforts to try and address these challenging social issues. Often we get in the business of reacting to problems rather than trying to prevent them in the first place. In many cases, it's hard enough ensuring funding for the services that are needed just to respond, such as in the case of assisting individuals leaving incarceration. We appreciate funds for just the immediate need, but don't take the time to stop and consider new and different ways of looking at the overall big picture. So I'm heartened to see that our witnesses today, whether using social impact bonds or not, are trying to encourage new thinking and new approaches to societal problems. And there are a lot more ideas out there, and more not-for-profits, state agencies, think tanks, and other groups trying to put ideas into action, which I applaud. I'm glad that this hearing is giving us a chance to think about how best to support these efforts and encourage further innovation. Innovation doesn't mean diverting efforts away from what governments and not-for-profits are already trying to do and the funding that they need to do it. But I'm sure there are lessons we can learn from what's being tried and use that information to improve our social programs. And if these initiatives are focusing attention on problems that need more solutions, that's helpful as well. I know that in addition to the work being done now in helping formerly incarcerated individuals find employment, New York State is moving forward with projects to address other challenges that could have greater effect down the road. They're trying to address early childhood health and wellness, diabetes prevention, school-based health centers, and providing alternatives to placement and detention for high at-risk youth. And none of these problems are going to be solved overnight, and there probably isn't going to be one right answer for every state or city or for every problem that is out there. The good news is that we have a lot of people, both in this room and outside of it, who are interested in working on a solution. Mr. Schaefer, in your written testimony, you phrase the effort behind social impact bonds as catalyzing. at all levels of government to address some of these challenging issues. And I think that goes to the heart of what we're considering here today. I look forward to continuing to work with all of you and with all of my colleagues on the committee on both sides of the aisle here in Congress to keep exploring ways to promote innovative policy ideas and to keep supporting the organizations that are doing this work all throughout our social policy programs beyond the incarcerated as well. But thank you for your work. And I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Well, that concludes our questioning and our hearing. I want to thank you all for being here today and sharing your testimony with us. And as you've heard, there's a lot of interest here, and therefore we held the hearing today to help us learn a little bit more. And there's a number of things that I kind of like to sum up things from my previous experience. You know, prevention is, of course, one of the things that in my past life as a law enforcement officer for 33 years is key, I think, to the success of our society. And I know that you're all looking for answers to prevent, young people, for example, from being homeless and find them loving homes. And we're working on that together here on this committee, subcommittee, and as a full committee. And keeping them off the streets and out of drugs, off of alcohol, and out of the drug scene, gangs, et cetera. That's all preventing people from ending up in, a place where Robert was. But Robert, those experiences build a man, and you have become quite a man. And so we're very proud to have you. It takes courage to be here today to tell your story. We're happy you had the courage to come and do that, because it will help people. And I know that's where you are today, not only striving to be a good American with a job and support a family, but you also want to help those who need help them from where you came, right? So I think we do need to take a look at these things. In my previous career, I had the responsibility of being a part of a team who investigated a series of murders in the Seattle area called the Green River serial murders. Back in those days, in the 80s, those young women on the streets were called prostitutes. Today, we know that that's not a correct word. They were criminalized, they were victimized at home, they ran away, and they were victimized again on the street, and then they were victimized again by the system. We've grown as a society, and we've recognized that these young ladies, and sometimes young boys, young girls, are not criminals. They're victims. And so our system needs to change in that regard as we look at those young girls and young boys on the street who are being victimized as victims and provide those services to them. And just in the same way that we provide services that we've talked about today. So when we talk about innovative, it's almost sometimes just a realization and a growth and a maturity of our community and recognizing that some criminals are not criminals, they're victims. And they need our assistance, they need our help, and they become productive citizens. Sometimes the federal government, I always like to joke when I go back to my district, and I know I'm going long, but I'm on my soapbox. I go back to my friends at home and I say, I'm from the federal government and I'm here to help. And they laugh. We are from the federal government, and this committee, this subcommittee is committed to helping in any way that we can. And your testimony today is going to help us decide how we can do that. So I am required to say, if members have additional questions for the witnesses, they will submit them to you in writing, and we would appreciate receiving your responses for the record within 2 weeks. Committee stands adjourned.